The great hall of Nexus Prime stretched out like a frozen ocean of crystal, its walls pulsing with soft blue light that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Today, it would witness what many believed would be humanity's end. Representative Cathera stood at the center of the chamber, her four arms moving in complex patterns as she addressed the assembled delegates. Her species, the Veltar, had ruled trade routes for over 10,000 years, and her voice carried the weight of ancient authority even through the mechanical translation devices. "Look at these numbers," she said, her clicks and hisses becoming words that echoed through the vast space. 300 years. That is all it took for these humans to spread across 17 star systems. My own people needed 3,000 years to properly colonize just one world. The holographic display above her head showed the cancer-like spread of human settlements across the galaxy's outer rim. Red dots marked their colonies, growing larger and brighter with each passing year. New Seoul, New Busan, the industrial complex of Kangwon Prime, the agricultural world of Kepler 442b. Each dot represented millions of humans, breeding and building and changing everything they touched. They terraform entire planets in decades, Cathera continued, her translator struggling with the emotion in her voice. They adapt to environments that should kill them. They reproduce at rates that make even the Zephyrian swarm mothers nervous. A ripple of uneasy agreement passed through the chamber. The Zephyrians had been the galaxy's most prolific species until humans arrived. Now their birth rates seemed sluggish by comparison. But worst of all, Cathera's voice dropped to what passed for a whisper among her kind, they contaminate other species with their madness, their reckless optimism, their bizarre emotional attachments to anything and everything they encounter. The evidence was displayed for all to see. Veltar merchants who had worked with humans were taking risks their species had avoided for millennia. Zephyrian scientists were forming emotional bonds with their research subjects. Even the ancient and logical Christek had been observed making what could only be called jokes after extended contact with human traders. The vote was swift and unanimous. The cleansing decree was passed by all 12 founding species of the Council. Humanity would be given exactly one galactic year to withdraw to their origin system, Sol. Any human presence beyond that boundary would be sterilized. 3,000 ships from across the galaxy began moving toward human space, the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. Admiral Lee Day stood on the command deck of Defense Station Alpha, watching Earth turn slowly below him. At 53 he had spent his entire adult life preparing for threats that might never come. Now the greatest threat in galactic history was bearing down on them and he felt strangely calm. The holographic message from the Council had been clear and cold. 1 year to evacuate 17 worlds and retreat to Sol. After that, any human found outside their home system would be killed without warning. "Admiral," his communications officer called out, her young voice tight with stress. "The evacuation fleets are reporting back. We can get maybe 60% of the outer colonies emptied in time. The rest will fight," Day said simply. "Signal all colonial governors. Tell them the choice is theirs, but anyone who stays behind knows what they're choosing." Across human space the great exodus began. Massive transport ships that had once carried supplies and trade goods were hastily converted to carry refugees. Families packed their lives into small bags and said goodbye to worlds they had called home for generations. Children born under alien suns would see Earth for the first time, if they were lucky enough to reach it. But not everyone could go and not everyone wanted to. On the farming world of Kepler 442b, Park Hannah stood in her wheat field and watched the last evacuation transport burn its way up through the atmosphere. The ship was overloaded with refugees from the outer settlements, families with children who deserved a chance at life. She was 42 years old and had spent half her life turning this world's harsh soil into fertile farmland. Her own children were safely aboard one of the earlier transports, probably halfway to Earth by now. Her husband had wanted to stay with her, but someone needed to look after their 2 young sons. Around her, 10,000 other colonists had made the same choice. They were farmers and miners, engineers and teachers, people who had built something beautiful on this distant world and refused to abandon it without a fight. "You think they'll really come?" asked Kim Woo, her neighbor from the next valley over. He was a small man who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of growing Earth vegetables in alien soil. "They'll come," Hannah said, hefting the modified farming laser in her hands. The weapon had been designed to clear stubborn weeds and rocks. Now it would have to serve a different purpose. The question is whether we can make them regret it. Above them the sky began to change. What had been empty space now showed tiny points of light moving against the stars. The Council fleet had arrived, massive ships filled with soldiers from a dozen different worlds, all united in their determination to wipe humanity from the galaxy. Park Hannah thought of her children, safe among the stars, and smiled grimly. She had helped plant the seeds that would feed a growing colony. Now she would plant different seeds, lessons written in fire and blood that humanity's enemies would carry with them forever. The first alien shuttles began their descent through Kepler 442b's atmosphere, expecting to find a defenseless farming world ready to surrender. Instead, they found humans who had turned their plowshares into swords. The first alien dropship landed in Park Hannah's wheat field with a sound like thunder, crushing rows of golden grain under its massive weight. The ship's doors opened with a hiss and 12 Veltar soldiers stepped out in their gleaming battle armor, expecting to find terrified farmers ready to surrender. Instead, they found Park Hannah sitting on her porch drinking tea and laughing. "You're late," she called out cheerfully. "We expected you 3 hours ago." The Veltar commander activated his translator. "Human female, you will surrender immediately or face extermination." Hannah took another sip of her tea and smiled. "That's very kind of you to offer, but I think I'll pass." She raised her modified farming laser, the same tool she had used for 20 years to clear rocks from her fields. The beam cut through the commander's armor like it was made of paper. What followed was chaos. Kim Woo's crop-spraying drone came buzzing over the hill, but instead of pesticide, it dropped explosive packages that had once been fertilizer containers. The alien soldiers scattered, but they were fighting on unfamiliar ground against people who knew every rock and tree for miles around. Within minutes, the dropship was burning. Within an hour, the entire Veltar landing force was either dead or running back to their ships in orbit. The battle for Kepler 442b lasted 3 days. The humans lost, of course. How could 10,000 farmers defeat a fleet of warships? But they made the aliens pay for every inch of ground. Every building became a fortress. Every tool became a weapon. Every farmer became a soldier who fought with the desperate creativity of someone protecting their home. Before the planet finally fell, the colonists transmitted everything they had learned. Council battle armor was strong but had weak joints. Veltar soldiers panicked when separated from their units. Zephyrian ships had blind spots in their sensor arrays. Most importantly, the aliens expected humans to fight like civilized soldiers, following rules and patterns that made sense. Humans did not fight like civilized soldiers. The war moved to New Olympia, where Captain Yoon-ji commanded a research station that studied fusion energy. When the Council fleet arrived, they found the orbital platforms abandoned and the surface installations seemingly empty. The alien commander was suspicious but not suspicious enough. Yoon-ji waited until half the enemy fleet was in orbit before she triggered the fusion research reactor. The explosion was visible from 3 star systems away. 47 alien ships were destroyed in the energy cascade that followed, and another 20 were damaged beyond repair. Yoon-ji died in that explosion along with her entire crew. But she took more enemy ships with her than humanity's entire colonial navy had destroyed in the war's first month. On the mining world of asteroid base Prometheus, Foreman Han Sol faced a different problem. His facility was built inside a cluster of asteroids, connected by tunnels and artificial gravity fields. When the Council fleet arrived, they expected to find miners hiding in their holes. Instead, they found that the miners had spent weeks calculating orbital mechanics. Han Sol had worked in space for 30 years. He knew how objects moved in vacuum, how momentum and gravity interacted, how much force was needed to push a 1,000,000-ton asteroid into a new trajectory. The cargo haulers that normally carried processed metals to market became kinetic weapons. Ships that had never been designed for combat accelerated to significant fractions of light speed and rammed into Council cruisers. The aliens had shields that could stop energy weapons and armor that could resist explosives, but they had no defense against a cargo ship moving at 50,000 kilometers per second. The Prometheus mining facility was eventually destroyed, but not before Han Sol turned the entire asteroid field into a graveyard of alien ships. World after world fell to the Council forces, but the pattern was always the same. The humans lost, but they made victory so expensive that the alien commanders began to dread each new battle. They had expected a quick war against a primitive species. Instead, they found humans who turned farming equipment into weapons, who used their own homes as bombs, who fought with a creativity that bordered on insanity. The Council had started the war with 3,000 ships. By the time they reached Earth's solar system, fewer than 800 remained operational. Entire alien species had been reduced to handfuls of survivors. The economic cost of the war had destroyed trade networks that had existed for thousands of years. But they had one, and now only one target remained, Earth itself. Admiral Cathera stood on the bridge of her flagship as the battered Council fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system. Her tactical display showed something that should have been impossible. The asteroid belt that had once orbited between Mars and Jupiter was gone, replaced by a maze of artificial structures. Orbital fortresses the size of cities floated where asteroids had once drifted. Weapons platforms bristled with guns that could crack planets. Mars itself had been turned into a military base, its surface covered with railgun batteries and missile launchers. And Earth's moon, humanity's ancient companion, had been hollowed out and converted into the largest fortress in known space. "Impossible," whispered Cathera's tactical officer, a young Zephyrian whose wings trembled with fear. "How did they build all this so quickly?" Cathera stared at the display and realized the truth. Humanity had been preparing for this moment since the war began. While their colonies fought and died, Earth had been turning its entire solar system into a weapon. Admiral Lee Day's voice echoed across all frequencies, reaching every ship in the Council fleet. "You wanted us gone from your galaxy. Come and try to take our home." The final battle was about to begin. The Battle of Sol began with a silence that stretched across space like a held breath. For 3 days, the Council fleet and humanity's orbital fortresses simply stared at each other across the void, each side knowing that what came next would change the galaxy forever. Commander Oh-min sat in the deepest part of Luna Base, 2 kilometers beneath the moon's surface, surrounded by screens that showed him every ship, every weapon, every desperate human invention that stood between Earth and extinction. At 38, he had been too young to remember when humans first reached the stars, but old enough to understand that he was watching their end. The first attack came from the Veltar flagship, a beam of pure energy that could have melted a mountain. It struck Fortress Alpha and simply vanished, absorbed by shields that humanity had built from technology they barely understood. Oh-min allowed himself a small smile. The aliens expected humans to fight with the weapons they knew about. They were wrong. The antimatter mines were Oh-min's favorite creation. Each one was no bigger than a briefcase, but they contained enough explosive power to crack a moon. More importantly, they were smart. The artificial intelligence inside each mine learned from every enemy movement, adapted to every tactic, evolved with each battle. The first wave of mines drifted toward the Council fleet like harmless debris. When the alien ships tried to destroy them with defensive fire, the mines dodged. When they tried to jam their sensors, the mines switched to different detection methods. When they tried to retreat, the mines followed. 37 Council ships died in the first hour. But the aliens adapted too. They sent waves of fighters to overwhelm the mines' tracking systems. They used their own artificial intelligence to predict the mines' behavior. They learned to work together in ways that made the weapons less effective. The battle raged for weeks, then months. Oh-min watched from his deep bunker as humanity unveiled weapon after weapon born from desperation and genius. Gravity well generators that could crush ships like tin cans. Kamikaze AI vessels that threw themselves at enemy formations and learned from each sacrifice how to be more deadly. Energy weapons that turned the enemy's own shields against them. The cost was terrible. Fortress Alpha fell after 6 months, taking 50,000 defenders with it. The Mars defense grid held for 8 months before the last railgun battery went silent. One by one, humanity's great works were ground down by the superior numbers and technology of the Council fleet. But the aliens were dying too. For every human fortress that fell, dozens of Council ships were destroyed. Entire species that had ruled the stars for thousands of years were reduced to scattered survivors. The Zephyrians, once the most numerous race in the galaxy, saw their numbers drop from billions to thousands. After 18 months of fighting, Earth's orbital defenses finally collapsed. Council ships began bombing the planet's cities, turning humanity's birth world into a burning wasteland. Oh-min received reports from across the globe. New York gone, London in flames, Tokyo a radioactive crater. Seoul was the last city standing. Colonel Seo-jun commanded the final human stronghold from the ruins of what had once been South Korea's capital. His force consisted of 300 Marines, some college students who had learned to use military weapons, and a handful of elderly veterans who remembered Earth's old wars. They faced 10,000 alien soldiers backed by orbital bombardment. The battle lasted 6 hours. Seo-jun's people fought from building to building, floor to floor, room to room. They had no chance of winning, but they made the aliens pay for every step. When only 50 humans remained, surrounded in the basement of what had once been a government building, Seo-jun made his final decision. "Tell my family I love them," he said into his radio, knowing no one was left to hear. Then he activated the city's fusion reactor and turned Seoul into a miniature sun. The explosion was visible from orbit. It killed Seo Jun and his remaining soldiers, but it also vaporized the entire alien landing force and damaged 3 council ships that had been providing fire support from low orbit. Representative Cathera stood in the radioactive ruins of what had once been Geneva, Switzerland. Her radiation suit protected her from the worst of the contamination, but she could still feel the heat from the melted buildings around her. She activated her communicator and broadcast to the entire galaxy. "The human contamination has been eliminated," she announced, her voice carrying across thousands of star systems. "Their homeworld burns. Their colonies are destroyed. Their species exists no more." It was true in a sense. Of the Council's mighty fleet of 3,000 ships, only 197 remained operational. The war had cost more than any conflict in galactic history. Trade routes that had existed for millennia were abandoned. Entire civilizations had collapsed under the economic strain. But they had won. The galaxy was safe from human contamination. Cathera was preparing to return to her flagship when the first disturbing report arrived. A deep space monitoring station near the galaxy's edge had detected ships with human markings moving through unexplored sectors. Another report came minutes later. Colonies thought destroyed were still transmitting. A third message spoke of impossible energy signatures from the void between stars. At first, Cathera dismissed these reports as mistakes or sensor ghosts. But they kept coming. Human ships spotted near the galactic core. Human radio signals from regions where no human colony had ever existed. Human technology signatures from star systems that weren't even on the official charts. The horrible truth began to dawn on her as she stood among the ashes of humanity's birth world. The Council's intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The 17 colony worlds they had destroyed had not contained all of humanity. Somewhere out in the vast darkness between the stars, other humans were still alive. And now they had watched their homeworld burn. Captain Nam Tae was checking the ship's water recycling system when the message arrived. The deep space exploration vessel Defiance had been drifting in the darkness between stars for 3 months, its crew of 200 souls living in the quiet routine of a ship far from any sun. They were mappers and explorers, part of humanity's scattered effort to chart the unknown regions of the galaxy. The transmission was old, its signal weak from traveling across impossible distances. Nam Tae listened to it 3 times before he truly understood what he was hearing. Earth was gone. Sol system had fallen. The war was over and humanity had lost. Around him, the bridge fell silent as his officers absorbed the news. Navigator Cho Min, who could read the movement of dark matter like her grandmother had read tea leaves, stared at her instruments with tears in her eyes. Engineer Park Soo, who had spent 15 years keeping their fusion reactor running without ever seeing a proper port, simply nodded as if he had expected this news all along. "Captain," asked Communications Officer Lee Yuna, her voice barely above a whisper, "what do we do now?" Nam Tae looked around at his crew, these people who had volunteered to spend their lives in the void between stars, mapping regions of space that might never be visited again. They were not the same humans who had left Earth decades ago. The deep void had changed them in ways that their planet-bound cousins could never understand. They thought in longer time scales now. Park Soo could plan reactor maintenance schedules that stretched across decades, understanding that their ship might not see civilization again for generations. Cho Min could navigate by reading the subtle gravity waves created by colliding black holes millions of years ago. They had learned patience from the stars themselves. "We wait," Nam Tae said finally. "And then we teach the galaxy what happens when you kill our world." The Defiance was not alone. Across the galaxy's unexplored regions, dozens of human ships received the same terrible news. Generation ships that had left Earth 50 years ago to establish colonies in distant galaxies. Research vessels studying phenomena that existed only in the deep void. Even individual families who had simply decided to see what lay beyond the edge of known space. They had been humanity's scattered seeds, sent out by a species that could never resist the urge to explore. Now they were all that remained of a civilization that had once dreamed of touching every star in the sky. But these humans were different from their Earth-born cousins in important ways. They had learned to think like the void itself, patient, vast, and utterly unforgiving. The response began small. A supply convoy carrying rare metals to the Veltar homeworld simply vanished between star systems. The cargo ships were found weeks later, drifting empty in space with their crews gone and their cargo holds stripped clean. There were no signs of violence, no distress calls, no evidence of what had happened. More convoys began disappearing. Communication relays that had functioned perfectly for thousands of years suddenly stopped working. The aliens discovered that their own technology had been turned against them, not damaged or destroyed, but reprogrammed with a skill that they couldn't understand. Trade vessels reported encounters with ghost ships that appeared from nowhere, disabled their escort vessels with weapons that seemed impossible, and then vanished back into hyperspace before reinforcements could arrive. The attackers never spoke, never made demands, never showed mercy. They struck and disappeared like shadows. The pattern spread across the galaxy. Not attacks on major worlds or military bases, those would be too obvious, too easy to defend against. Instead, the hidden humans struck at the invisible threads that held galactic civilization together. The supply lines and communication networks and trade routes that nobody ever thought about until they stopped working. On the exploration vessel Defiance, Captain Nam Te studied reports from across known space. His ship had become an unofficial coordination center for the scattered human fleets, a place where information was gathered and plans were made. The Veltar have lost 60% of their shipping, reported communications officer Li Yuna. The Zephyrians are talking about abandoning 3 entire star systems because they can't maintain supply lines. And the contamination? Namte asked. Engineer Park Su smiled grimly. Spreading faster than they can contain it. The Council had been right to fear human contamination, but they had misunderstood what it really was. It wasn't biological or technological. It was ideological, a way of thinking that spread from human to alien like a virus. On the Veltar homeworld, merchants who had worked with human traders before the war began taking risks that their species had avoided for millennia. They formed partnerships based on trust rather than contracts, invested in long-term projects that might not pay off for decades, and began to see profit as less important than progress. Zephyrian scientists who had observed human behavior during the war started forming emotional attachments to their research subjects. They began asking different questions, pursuing knowledge for its own sake rather than for immediate practical applications. Some even began keeping pets, a concept that had been unknown in their culture for thousands of years. Even the logical Christek, beings of living mineral who had never shown emotion, were observed making what could only be called jokes after extended contact with human prisoners during the war. The contamination was spreading across the galaxy, and the Council survivors were powerless to stop it. Their own people were changing, becoming more like humans in ways that their leaders found terrifying. Representative Cathera, struggling to hold together the remnants of galactic civilization, received reports daily of new outbreaks of human-like behavior. Her own advisors were beginning to suggest radical ideas like cooperation and emotional decision-making. She had won the war and purged humanity from the galaxy. But somehow, in victory, she was losing everything she had fought to preserve. Representative Cathera sat alone in the vast command chamber of the Council's last dreadnought, staring at reports that told the same story over and over again. Her civilization was falling apart, not from external attack, but from something far more dangerous, change from within. On Veltar Prime, merchants were forming cooperatives instead of competing with each other. On the Zephyrian colonies, scientists were sharing research freely instead of hoarding it for profit. Across a dozen worlds, rigid social hierarchies that had existed for thousands of years were crumbling as ordinary citizens began to demand something called individual rights. 5 years had passed since Earth burned, since humanity had been purged from the galaxy. The Council had won their war, but victory felt like poison in Cathera's mouth. Of the great civilization that had ruled the stars for millennia, only fragments remained. Trade networks had collapsed. Entire species had fallen into civil war. The galaxy was dying, and she was the only leader left with any real authority. The transmission arrived on a frequency that made her technical officers panic. It should not have existed, the encryption was impossible, the signal strength suggested technology far beyond anything in the Council databases, and somehow it had bypassed every security system on her ship as if they weren't there at all. A human face appeared on her screen. Cathera had expected to see a desperate refugee, perhaps a survivor begging for mercy or negotiating from weakness. Instead, she saw a man who looked like he owned the galaxy. His uniform was clean and well-tailored, his expression calm and confident. Behind him, the bridge of his vessel showed something that made her translator stumble in confusion. Multiple species working together with an efficiency that her own rigid command structure had never achieved. Representative Cathera, the human said, and she was startled to hear him pronounce her name correctly, with the proper tonal inflections that few aliens ever mastered. My name is Nam Te, and I speak for the scattered fleet of humanity. Impossible, Cathera whispered. Your species is extinct. Your worlds are ash. Nam Te smiled, and somehow that expression was more frightening than any weapon. Some of our worlds, yes. Some of our people, certainly. But humanity has always been hard to kill completely. We have a habit of spreading to places where people don't think to look. Behind him, Kathera could see his crew more clearly now. Veltar working alongside humans. Zephyrians and Christek sharing data terminals. Even some species she didn't recognize, beings that might have been thought extinct for centuries. They moved together like parts of a single organism, efficient and purposeful in ways that made her own hierarchical command structure look clumsy by comparison. I have an offer for you, Namte continued. Unconditional surrender. Yours, not ours. Kathera's translator struggled with the concept. You are defeated. Your homeworld is destroyed. You cannot possibly dash. Can't we? Namte gestured to something off-screen, and suddenly Kathera's tactical display lit up with new contacts. Ships were appearing around her dreadnought, dozens of them, vessels of designs she had never seen before. They had been there all along, hidden by technology that made them invisible to her best sensors. Your economy is collapsing, Namte said matter-of-factly. Your member worlds are in revolt. Your military consists of one damaged dreadnought and maybe 50 escort vessels scattered across the galaxy. In 6 months, maybe a year, galactic civilization will collapse completely into chaos and barbarism. He was right, and they both knew it. The war had cost too much, destroyed too much, changed too much. The galaxy that had existed before humanity's arrival was already gone, replaced by something unstable and unpredictable. What do you want? Kathera asked. A new beginning, Namte replied. Dissolution of the old council and establishment of a new galactic government. One based on cooperation instead of control, adaptation instead of stagnation, and the radical idea that diversity makes civilization stronger rather than threatening it. The alternative, he explained with chilling calm, was simple. Complete economic and social collapse. The end of interstellar civilization. A new dark age that might last for thousands of years, during which the scattered human fleets would simply wait in the void between stars until the galaxy was ready to start over. Kathera stared at the human on her screen and realized the cosmic irony of their situation. The Council had sought to destroy humanity to preserve their galaxy, but in doing so, they had created something far more dangerous than anything they had originally faced. These humans had been tempered by extinction, forged by loss into something harder and more patient than their planet-bound ancestors. They had learned to think in geological time scales, to plan across generations, to turn the vastness of space itself into their greatest weapon. They were no longer the reckless young species that had worried the Council decades ago. They had become something new, something that could survive anywhere and adapt to anything. The signing will take place aboard our vessel in neutral space, Namte said. Captain Li Yun of the Generation ship New Horizon will serve as our chief negotiator. We expect you to come alone, with full authority to speak for what remains of the Council. As Namte's transmission ended, Kathera's sensors detected more ships emerging from the void. Vessels carrying representatives from dozens of species, many of whom she had thought were extinct. They had been hiding in the deep darkness between stars, waiting for this moment. The galaxy she had known was gone forever. In its place, something unprecedented was being born, a truly collaborative civilization where humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their stubbornness, but their ability to inspire others to become more than they had ever thought possible. Kathera prepared to attend her own civilization's funeral, and the birth of something entirely new.